Dirty barbarians? Not quite. Vikings actually bathed once a week more often than many Europeans of their time. They used bone combs to fight off lice, and even carried little ear spoons to scoop out wax. Today, we'll dive into the fascinating world of Viking hygiene, busting the myths and uncovering their clever grooming habits. Stick around, because beyond hygiene, we'll reveal even more surprising details about daily Viking life you've probably never heard. The first breath of morning inside a Viking longhouse was heavy with the mingled scents of smoke, sweat, and wool. Yet it was also the moment when the rhythm of life stirred awake. What hygiene was like in Viking times and more is not simply told in soap and water, but in the quiet customs of dawn, when even before a Viking man strapped on his sword or a Viking woman prepared the day's bread, there was a duty to order, to cleanse, and to prepare both body and hall for another day beneath the northern sky. The longhouse was no palace of marble, but it was alive with discipline. Bedding of straw and linen was shaken out and taken near the doorway, letting the chill air of the fjord sweep through the fibres and drive away the damp of night. A Viking child might be sent to beat the blankets with a stick, watching the dust rise like ghosts in the sunbeams that slanted through smoke holes. These were not idle chores. To sleep in musty bedding was to court vermin, to invite lice and sickness, and so the first task of the morning was to keep one's resting place fresh enough to endure the endless winters. The hearth followed. Ashes from the night's fire were raked aside, embers coaxed to life, and fresh kindling laid down. Flame was not only warmth or a place to cook Viking food, it was a purifier, burning away smells and keeping the air dry. Pots of water were set near the fire so they would not freeze, for even washing one's hands in cold rivers was a harsh task in frost season. The hearth, glowing again, cast its orange light across the benches, the rafters, the carved posts that held stories of gods and ancestors. Water itself was a treasure. Young ones were sent with wooden buckets to the well or stream, trudging back with shoulders bowed under the weight. This water was not wasted. A Viking woman would keep a bowl near the doorway, where hands and faces might be splashed before meals. The rough linen cloths, woven by her own hand, wiped away the grit of sleep. Such small ablutions were the core of hygiene, not bathing in tubs each day, but steady, constant touches of cleanliness, repeated like prayers. The longhouse air was thick with smoke, yet there was method in this too. Smoke drove away biting insects, preserved food hanging from the rafters, and hardened wood against rot. Still, the people did not wish to choke on it. Doors were flung open when weather allowed, letting the draught sweep the length of the hall, clearing the air before the day's labours began. A Viking man, tightening the straps of his boots, would draw in that cold rush of wind and feel ready for the tasks of farming, fishing, or war. Clean garments also marked the morning. The shift of linen worn beneath woolen tunics was changed as often as one could afford. White cloth, well kept, was a sign of honour. Even if weeks passed without full bathing, a fresh underlayer gave the sense of dignity and steadiness. It was a shield against filth, as surely as iron was a shield in battle. Thus the dawn in a Viking household was not idle yawning, but a ritual of quiet purification. From airing straw beds to fetching icy water, from raking ashes to laying on fresh garments, every action spoke of resilience. Hygiene in Viking times was woven into the day's first light, practical, unadorned, yet powerful enough to shape health, order, and reputation. It was the unseen armour with which the Northmen faced their world, long before blade or oar was taken in hand. The week in a Viking village carried its own rhythm, and though toil filled most days, there was one set apart, a day when the ordinary grime of labour gave way to ritual. Saturday is for washing lagadaga, the washing day when hearths steamed, buckets filled, and the entire household turned its attention from ploughing, weaving, or hunting to the cleansing of body and garment. To a Viking man, this was not vanity. To a Viking woman, it was not indulgence. It was the mark of order, of discipline, of presenting oneself before kin and gods with a measure of dignity. When the sun rose on Lagardaga, the longhouse stirred earlier than usual. Water had to be fetched in greater quantity than on other days, drawn from streams, wells or springs, and carried back in heavy wooden pails. A Viking child often shouldered this task, trudging barefoot over frosted grass or muddy paths, the sloshing water threatening to spill with each step. Inside, the hearth blazed hotter than usual, stones heated in the flames until they glowed, then plunged into cauldrons to warm the gathered water. Steam rose in ghostly veils, filling the dim interior with the smell of wet wood and herbs, thrown in for freshness, sage, juniper, sometimes wild thyme gathered from the hills. Men and women washed separately, modesty guarded even in a culture accustomed to the hardships of travel and war. A Viking man would strip down and pour water over his head, rubbing his skin with a rough cloth, scraping away sweat and soil from a week of fieldwork or raiding preparation. Combs of bone or antler were drawn through tangled hair and beard, teeth tight enough to drag free the lice that plagued all households. Each nit caught was a small victory, and combs found in Viking graves still whisper of this endless battle for cleanliness. A Viking woman, tending to her daughters or younger children, washed with quieter determination. Hair was rinsed in warmed water mixed with herbs, both for scent and for strength, while hands red from weaving and spinning were soothed in bowls of fragrant water. Clothing, too, was scrubbed linen shifts beaten on stones by the riverbank, woolen tunics soaked in lye water to drive out grease. On washing day, streams rang with laughter and chatter as women bent over the currents, beating cloth against the flow, their voices carrying news and gossip across the village. Cleanliness bore a deeper meaning than mere comfort. To sit at the thing, to speak before neighbours, or to enter a hall unwashed was a silent insult. A Viking man who let his beard grow wild and his tunic stink of sweat was judged careless, unworthy of command or respect. A Viking woman who neglected her household's linen risked whispers that her family lacked order or piety. Freshness was not luxury, it was a sign of honour, of self-control, of the invisible line that separated the civilized hall from the chaos of the wild. By evening, the village itself seemed transformed. The air carried the mingled scents of herbs, smoke, and clean linen. Children, their hair combed and faces scrubbed, tumbled in play while elders sat with garments less crusted, skin glowing faintly from steam and water. Saturday was not merely washing day, it was a renewal, a binding of the community together in shared ritual. When the week began again, sweat and dirt would return, but Lagardaga remained the reminder that even in the harshness of the north, the Vikings sought to live not only fierce, but clean. The elements ruled the north, and the Viking people learned to bend them to their will. Fire, water, steam. These were not luxuries, but tools of survival, weapons against filth and cold, and tokens of dignity, in a world where the sea itself could swallow a man whole. To understand hygiene in Viking times, one must step into the places where flame, water, and vapour met, and see how the Northmen cleansed not only their bodies but their spirits. Fire came first. Without flame there was no comfort, no cooking, no washing. Each longhouse hearth was a beating heart, kept alive day and night, guarded even in sleep. When washing was needed, stones were thrust deep into the coals until they glowed like embers of the gods. These stones were then carried carefully with tongs and plunged into wooden tubs filled with water, sending up a hiss that echoed like a serpent's breath. Steam curled through the rafters, softening the woolen garments hung overhead, loosening the grime from tired skin. A Viking man returning from the fields would strip off his sweat-soaked tunic and pour the heated water over his shoulders, gritting his teeth as cold flesh surrendered to warmth. A Viking woman, weary from weaving and tending the hearth, would soak her arms in the same steam, letting the fire's gift soothe joints worn from the loom. But the Vikings were not content with buckets and tubs alone. In some places, they built small steam huts, rudimentary bathrooms, where water was poured over hot stones to fill the chamber with thick vapour. Families or comrades would sit together, their bodies glistening, scraping away sweat with rough cloths, or simply letting the heat purge their pores. It was not only cleansing, it was healing. Muscles unknotted, wounds closed, lungs cleared. The Viking child, laughing in the haze, learned early that steam was a friend as much as a foe. Nowhere, however, was water more powerful than in Iceland, where the very earth boiled beneath the people's feet. Hot springs, bubbling from the ground, offered baths that no firewood was needed to prepare. Travellers on long journeys would strip naked in the mist and lower themselves into pools that smelled of sulphur and warmth, their cries of relief carrying across the valley. Here the elements met without human aid, earth and fire birthing water hot enough to cleanse a body chilled by days of rain. These springs became gathering places where warriors, farmers and wanderers shared both warmth and words, steam rising like banners above their heads. Season dictated habit. In summer, when streams ran free and days stretched long, bathing in rivers or lakes was common, their cold waters sharp as iron but bracing to the flesh. The sun dried garments quickly, and the air was gentle enough to make a full wash bearable. In winter, however, bathing shifted to survival's edge. A Viking man might splash his face or hands with melted snow, but plunging into icy rivers was for the reckless or the desperate. Then fire and steam were cherished above all, the hearth turned into a bathhouse, the tub or steam hut into sanctuaries of heat against the killing frost. Thus, the Vikings lived between extremes, using fire, water, and steam as both shield and ritual. In the crackle of burning logs, in the hiss of stones plunged into water, in the mist rising from earth itself, they carved out moments of purity amidst struggle. Their world was harsh, yet in the embrace of steam, the Viking people found not only cleanliness, but strength, stepping from fire-warmed baths, ready to face sea, soil, and storm once more. Soap from ash and fat was not born from vanity, but from necessity, forged in the same spirit that shaped swords and sails. The Viking people did not have rows of scented cakes or perfumed oils to soften their skin. What they had was the forest, the herd, and the fire. And from these, they crafted their weapon against dirt and grease, the humble sap. The making of sap began with ash. After a night, when the longhouse fire burned low, the grey dust of birch logs was gathered and set aside. Birch ash was prized above others, for when mixed with water, it gave a strong lye, sharp enough to bite through grease, strong enough to strip the filth from tunic or cloak. Into this caustic brew was added the rendered fat of sheep, goat, or sometimes cattle, collected after a slaughter. The process was no gentle craft. A Viking woman stood over a steaming pot, stirring the thick mixture with a wooden paddle, the stench of tallow clinging to her hair and garments. Slowly, the blend hardened into lumps that bore little beauty but carried fierce power. To touch this soap to the skin was no small thing. A Viking man might rub his hands with it after slaughtering animals, washing away the blood before he sat to eat. A Viking child, dirt smeared across face and arms, might be scrubbed raw with it when filth grew too heavy to ignore. But more often, sap was kept for linens and wool. The lye burned harshly, and skin treated too often with it could crack and sting. Clothing, however, demanded its strength. Shirts and shifts of linen were boiled with the soap until the water frothed grey, the dirt beaten out with sticks on stones by the river. The garments that emerged were not soft, but they were clean, and cleanliness was honour. A white undertunic showed not just wealth, but discipline, a mark that one's household held order. There was ritual in this too. Before festivals, before journeys, before meetings at the Thing, Families would labour to wash garments with soap, for appearance spoke as loudly as words. A man who reeked of sweat and wore stained wool might be judged unworthy to speak in council. A woman whose linens were grey instead of bright risked whispers of neglect. Soap, crude as it was, upheld reputation as much as it scoured cloth. Still, the making of sap carried more than practical value. It was a skill passed from hand to hand, from mother to daughter, an art of transforming the remnants of fire and slaughter into something useful. In the stench of fat and the sting of lye lay a quiet triumph, the ability to master filth with the tools of survival. So when we speak of soap from ash and fat, we speak not of luxury, but of resilience. It was harsh, it was bitter, and yet it kept the Viking world from drowning in its own grime. With every lump of sap beaten into linen, with every arm scrubbed raw before a feast, the Vikings proved that even in a land of cold seas and harsher winds, cleanliness had its place alongside strength and courage. Linen, the hidden hero of Viking life, a quiet thread that held dignity together in a world where full bathing was rare and firewood too precious to waste on steaming tubs each day. If a Viking man strode into the thing with clean garments, or if a Viking woman greeted her neighbours with white linen shining beneath her wool, it was not the sign of idle wealth but of discipline and care. For while sweat and soil were part of daily toil, it was linen more than soap, more than steam, that stood as the first shield of cleanliness. Linen began in the fields, in the stubborn stalks of flax that grew tall beneath the northern sun. It was no small task to bring it to cloth. Stalks were pulled by hand, dried, soaked until they softened, beaten, and combed into fine fibres. From there came spinning, the whir of distaff and spindle in the hands of a Viking woman, her fingers quick as she twisted the pale threads that would one day become undergarments. On the loom, these threads were woven into shifts, shirts, and smocks, garments that clung close to the body and absorbed what the world pressed upon the flesh: sweat, dust, grease from Viking food, the grime of soil and sea. To wear linen was to have a barrier. Wool tunics, dyed bright or left in natural shades, were heavy, hard to clean, and easily soiled. But linen could be changed, washed, and beaten white again. A Viking child might roll in the dirt, but his mother would strip the shift, scrub it in the river with lye, and hang it in the sun until it gleamed once more. The child might smell of goats or fish, but his linen told another story, that his household cared for order. Whitening linen was itself a ritual. Women would lay damp cloth across the grass in summer fields, letting the sun bleach it pale. The sight of white linen, drying in neat rows, was more than domestic labour, it was pride. A man in clean linen stood taller before his kin, his beard combed, his shift bright. It said he was no wanderer without hearth, but a man with family, with care, with honour. Even warriors knew the worth of it. Beneath mail and leather, a Viking man wore linen. It spared his skin from chafing, absorbed sweat beneath iron, and could be stripped and cleaned while armour could not. In sagas and in graves alike, the undergarment is there, a silent testament that even the fiercest axe-wielder valued what lay unseen. Constant changing mattered more than baths. Water could be treacherous, thought to open the body to illness, and soap was harsh, reserved for linens more than flesh. But a shift of linen could be stripped and washed without danger, replaced with another fresh from the sun. Thus, in the rhythm of days, cleanliness was not measured by nakedness in water, but by the brightness of cloth against the skin. So, linen, humble and often overlooked, was the true ally of Viking hygiene. It did not shine like gold, nor sing like steel, but it whispered of care, of honour, of quiet strength. It was the hidden hero, the garment that made even the muddiest Viking farmer or the most sea-worn Viking raider stand among his people with dignity intact. In the earth where Viking graves lie, not only swords, brooches, and drinking horns have been uncovered, but stranger treasures, small tools of bone and antler, delicate as they are enduring. Combs, tweezers, ear spoons. Objects that whisper of a truth often forgotten, that the Viking man and woman were as concerned with their appearance as they were with their weapons. These humble pieces of daily life, carried on belts, slipped into pouches, and sometimes buried with the dead, reveal that grooming was not vanity, but honour. The comb was king among them, carved from antler or bone, sometimes fitted with bronze rivets. These combs were not merely for neatness, but for battle against the eternal foe, lice. Teeth set fine and close together pulled through the thick hair of a Viking child, scraping away nits and crawling pests that thrived in bedding and clothing. Archaeologists have found combs worn smooth by years of use, their handles etched with simple designs, proof that they were more than tools, they were companions, as essential as a knife or whetstone. To see a Viking man with hair combed and beard ordered was to see respect for himself and for those around him. To be unkempt was to invite insult, for sagas tell of men mocked, not only for cowardice, but for filth. Tweezers, slender and sharp, were likewise found in graves across the north. Carried in small toilet kits strung from belts, they spoke of detail and care. A Viking woman might pluck stray hairs, shaping brows with the same discipline she applied to weaving or cooking Viking food. A Viking man might keep his beard trimmed, removing what grew uneven, ensuring that when he stood before the thing or sailed with comrades, no one could whisper that he looked like a wild beast from the forest. Grooming, in this way, was tied to reputation. Honour was not only in deeds, but in bearing. Then there were the ear spoons, tiny scoops of bone or metal, strange to modern eyes, yet common among the people of the fjords. Hung from rings or chains, they were used to clean the ear, keeping hearing sharp for the call of horns, the crackle of fire, the whisper of an enemy's step in the dark. To neglect such things was to risk deafness, and in a world of oaths and war, every sense mattered. These spoons, simple yet precise, show how deeply the Vikings prized readiness, even in the smallest matters of the body. Together, these tools formed the quiet arsenal of daily life. They were found in men's graves as well as women's, showing that both cared for appearance, that hygiene was woven into the fabric of honour. A warrior might die with his sword, but he was buried with his comb as well, for clean hair and a clear face spoke of dignity that death could not erase. So, when we speak of combs, tweezers, and ear spoons, we are not speaking of trifles. We are speaking of the hidden face of Viking life, a people fierce in battle, yes, but also fierce in self-respect. Beneath the smoke and sweat, beneath the grime of field and sea, lay a constant effort to remain presentable before gods, kin, and foes alike. Cleanliness was not softness. It was strength, carved into antler and bone, carried into both life and death. Hair and beards carried meaning in the Viking world, more than cloth or coin ever could. A man's locks and beard were banners of his honour. A woman's braids spoke of her place in hearth and hall, and every strand was tended with a care that belies the image of the Viking as a wild and filthy raider. To the people of the north, hair was identity, a living mark of strength, beauty, and place in society. The comb was always near, pulled through hair morning and night. A Viking man with long hair would draw it back into braids, both to keep it from tangling in the wind and to show discipline. A warrior's braids were practical, keeping strands from catching on helm or blade, but they also signalled readiness, the look of a man who respected himself as much as he respected his comrades. A Viking child, too young for war, might wear hair bound in simple plaits, a small echo of the styles of their elders, learning early that even appearance was a lesson in honour. Beards held power of their own. The sagas often praise a man not only for his courage, but for his beard, thick and well kept. To let a beard run wild was to risk being called slovenly, but to keep it combed, oiled, and shaped was to command respect. Oils of animal fat or herbs rubbed into whiskers gave shine and softness, while ashlie was sometimes used to lighten hair, turning beards a striking blonde or reddish hue. A Viking man, who stepped before the thing with his beard gleaming in the sun, declared without words that he was of stature, that he belonged among the voices of law and decision. For women, hair was equally a language. A Viking woman, unmarried, might let her hair flow loose or in long braids, while the married bound theirs more tightly, often beneath a headdress. It was both custom and signal, a way for the community to see who was maiden, who was wife, who commanded her own hearth. Care was constant. Hair was washed when water allowed, rinsed with herbs for scent, combed to gleam in firelight. At feasts, a woman's hair, woven with ribbons or beads, could draw as much admiration as her jewellery. In battle, hair and beard were war paint of their own. Men often tied their hair back so it would not blind them, some even plaiting beards to keep them from tangling in combat. Enemies and allies alike judged character by these marks. A man with a neat braid or trimmed beard was disciplined, while a man unkempt might be thought reckless or weak. Appearance could sway respect as swiftly as steel. Thus, hair and beards were never mere ornament. They were shields of honour, messages of status, and emblems of readiness. Each Viking man bore his beard like a crest. Each Viking woman wove her hair like a song. Together, they showed that in a world of cold seas and harsher fates, dignity was carried not only in sword or shield, but in the way the Northmen wore the hair upon their heads and faces. Lice and fleas were the true conquerors of the North, small tyrants that plagued both king and thrall, reminding all that even the fiercest axe could not keep every enemy at bay. To live in a Viking household was to live with these creatures, and to fight them endlessly with patience, fire, and cunning. Delousing the North was not an occasional chore, but a ritual of survival, carried out in the glow of the hearth as much as in the fields or rivers. Each morning or evening, the comb was brought forth, its fine teeth carved of antler or bone. A Viking man would sit by the fire, while his wife or child dragged the comb through his beard, scraping out the stubborn lice that clung like hidden raiders. A Viking woman, in turn, would endure the same, her long hair divided into sections, strands pulled taut while the pests were hunted one by one. Children squirmed and complained, but the task was as necessary as eating Viking food or mending cloaks. When the comb's teeth caught a louse, it was flicked into the fire with a hiss, its body popping in the flames, a small but satisfying execution. Clothing, too, was a battlefield. Linen shifts and woolen tunics, once stripped from the body, were scalded in boiling water mixed with ash or lye. Women carried garments to rivers, beating them upon stones, then hung them by the smoke of the hearth or across bushes in the cold sun. Heat was the great weapon. Near the fire, shirts were held up to flames until the cloth steamed and pests died in their folds. Many sagas and old tales speak of men warming their clothes by the fire, not for comfort, but for war against unseen enemies. It was pest execution, plain and merciless. For those with means or boldness, shaving was another answer. Monks who joined Viking settlements often carried this practice, their heads bare and smooth, denying lice any place to hide. Some warriors, too, cut their hair short or shaved beards entirely, choosing sharp steel over constant scratching. Yet, vanity and tradition often clashed with this cure, for long hair and proud beards carried honour, and many endured the itch rather than sacrifice their mark of status. Fleas, quick and biting, infested bedding and straw-filled mattresses. Smoke was their bane. Herbs, such as juniper or mugwort, were burned within the hall, the fumes driving out the vermin, even if it choked those who inhaled it. Fresh straw was laid often, old bedding dragged outside and shaken until the air swirled with dust and the ground crawled with tiny exiles. Dogs and cats carried their share of pests as well, scratching and twitching beside their masters, equal victims of the creeping horde. Delousing was not shameful. It was communal. Families sat together at the hearth, picking through each other's hair, flicking lice into the flames, speaking of the day's work while they waged war on their smallest foes. Kings may have feasted in gilded halls, but even they could not claim freedom from the itch. In this, the Viking world was equalized, man, woman, child, and thrall, bound together by the constant battle against vermin. So the North endured, comb in hand, fire crackling, garments steaming in the winter air. Victory was never permanent, but each dead louse or flea was a reminder of stubborn resilience. In a land of war, frost, and sea, the Vikings learned that honour was not only won with blade and shield. It was also guarded in the quiet, relentless fight against the itch of vermin that sought to rule them all. Teeth told their own sagas in the north, carved not in runes but in enamel and bone. To look into the mouth of a Viking man or Viking woman was to glimpse the story of their food, their health, and their habits. In an age before sweet confections and refined sugar, Viking teeth were spared the black rot that later ages knew too well. Their diets of fish, meat, and hardy grains left them less prone to decay, yet far from perfect. For in every loaf of bread ground on stone querns, fine grit worked its way into the dough. With every bite, that grit scoured enamel, wearing teeth flat, carving lines into them as surely as the sea wears grooves into a cliff. Skeletal remains from burial mounds show this truth clearly. Viking jaws reveal teeth ground down to stubs, edges smooth from years of chewing bread laced with stone dust. Cavities were rare, but abscesses left their mark, hollow sockets where infection gnawed deeper than hunger ever could. Yet, despite this wear, many Viking elders carried a surprising number of teeth to their graves, a testament to a diet that cut less sugar but gave no mercy with grit. How, then, did they care for their mouths? Here, the small details of life emerge. Toothpicks of bone and metal have been found. Slim rods used to dig between teeth after meals of Viking food heavy with meat and grain. They served not only to clean but to bring relief when fibres and seeds lodged stubbornly in the gums. Twigs, too, were pressed into service. A Viking child might fray the end of a hazel branch by chewing until it spread into soft fibres, then use it to rub against teeth, a crude but effective brush. Birch and elm served the same, their fibres carrying the faint taste of wood and sap. Mouth rinses were known, though never as gentle as mint. Vinegar, mead, or even herbal water steeped with sage or rosemary might be swished around the mouth, both to sharpen the breath and to ward off lurking ills. Fennel seeds and cloves, carried from trade routes, were chewed to freshen breath, though such luxuries were not for every hall. More common was the taste of ash or charcoal, rubbed on a rag and scrubbed across the teeth, leaving them cleaner, if not smoother. Breath, too, carried weight in a hall. To speak before others with foul odour was no small shame. A Viking man preparing for the thing might clean his teeth with twig or cloth, not from vanity but from duty, knowing his words would carry farther if his mouth did not betray him with stench. Women, tending to children and kin, did the same, for cleanliness was part of household honour. So the Vikings fought decay with what they had: twigs, picks, rinses, and grit-ground bread. Their skeletons tell of pain, yes, of abscess and loss, but also of resilience. They lacked our ease, yet they endured, their teeth carrying them through a life of hard chewing and harder winters. In the end, their smiles were not white or straight by modern fancy, but they were strong enough to gnaw dried fish, tear through mutton, and laugh loud around the fire. And that, to a Viking, was more than enough. The scents of the north were as much a part of Viking life as the creak of oars or the clash of steel. To step into a longhouse was to be struck by a tide of odours, smoke from the hearth, clinging to every timber, the musk of animals mingled with damp wool, the tang of salted fish, and beneath it all the faint sweetness of herbs, worn like armour against the stench of the world. For in Viking times, scent was not a luxury, it was survival, honour, and sometimes even deception. Clothes were the first vessels of smell. A Viking man's tunic, woven thick from sheep's wool, soaked in the smoke of the fire each night, until it carried the fragrance of ash wherever he went. A Viking woman's shift, washed in river water and beaten with birch branches, bore the ghost of grass and the faint sourness of lye. Even clean garments never lost the memory of smoke. To smell of the hearth was to smell of home. Yet too much dampness or neglect turned wool into a swamp of odours, rank enough to shame its wearer. Thus, constant tending, airing, and smoking of cloth was not idle work, but a fight to keep one's presence tolerable. Herbs offered a gentler touch. Rosemary, though foreign to many northern fields, found its way along trade routes, prized for its sharp fragrance. A Viking woman might steep sprigs in hot water, using the rinse to wash her hair or cloak her garments in a veil of freshness. Yarrow, common in the meadows, was crushed into rinses and poultices, its bitter scent thought to guard against both rot and sickness. Juniper branches smouldered in the hearth, filling the air with resinous smoke that drove out fleas while sweetening the hall. To tuck a sprig of thyme into one's clothing or braid was a mark of care, a signal that even in hardship one did not surrender wholly to filth. Yet not all scents came from herbs and smoke. Animal musk was ever present, the hides used for cloaks, the tallow rubbed into beards, the fat burned in lamps, all carried the breath of beast. A Viking child nestled in furs smelled of goat or sheep as surely as of his mother's arms. Even perfumes, rare luxuries traded from the East, were often made from civet or musk, animal notes that clung heavily to the body. For the North knew little of delicate sweetness. Its perfumes were raw, earthy, and primal. The line between pleasant and pungent was thin, and often walked without choice. What smelled wholesome to one might smell rancid to another. A warrior returning from sea reeked of salt, tar, sweat, and fish, yet among his kin such odours spoke of labour and courage. A woman whose hair carried rosemary was admired, yet if her tunic was damp with mildew, whispers would rise. Smell was reputation, as much as voice or bearing. So the Vikings lived in a world thick with scent herbs, musk, smoke, and sweat, mingling in ways both harsh and haunting. They did not chase purity of fragrance as later ages would. Instead, they wove the smells of earth, beast, and fire into their daily lives, carrying them as badges of place and person. To smell of rosemary and juniper was pride. To smell only of rot was shame. And so, in the battle between pleasant and pungent, the Vikings fought with smoke, herbs, and will, ensuring that even in the hardest times, the North carried its own fierce perfume. In the rhythm of Viking life, women carried the weight not only of hearth and harvest, but of daily care, small, constant rituals that stitched dignity into the rough weave of survival. Women's everyday care was not painted in extravagance, but in steady discipline, a quiet strength as vital as sword or plough. The sight of a Viking woman, hair bound beneath a kerchief or cap, garments fresh with the scent of smoke and river water, told of her household's honour as surely as a warrior's gleaming blade told of his courage. Hair was the first to be tended. Loose locks were rare among married women, for custom and modesty bound them. A head covering, often linen or wool, shielded hair from smoke, grease, and lice, while marking a woman's place in the order of life. A maiden might walk with her braids uncovered, but once wed, her hair was bound, veiled, or wrapped. Yet hidden did not mean neglected. Women rinsed their hair in herbal waters when they could rosemary, or nettle when trade or meadow allowed, and combed with antler tools to keep it sleek and ordered. Beneath the veil there was pride, even if the world did not see it. Linen shifts and tunics set the cycle of labour. A Viking woman oversaw laundering, a task of boiling, beating, and bleaching that demanded more muscle than grace. She scrubbed her children's shifts until they whitened in the sun, knowing that clean linen was more than comfort, it was reputation. Villagers marked a household by its clothing, and a woman who let her family wear soiled garments risked whispers of neglect. Even when her hands cracked from lye and river water, she laboured on, for fresh underlayers mattered more than rare baths. Her care ensured that her kin stood before others looking disciplined, not dishevelled. Skin and hair oils, often simple blends of animal fat mixed with herbs, softened what the northern wind would otherwise strip raw. A Viking child might have his cheeks rubbed with grease to guard against frost, while a Viking man's beard could be tamed with a smear of tallow infused with sweet-smelling plants. Women themselves used these oils sparingly, applying them to hands roughened by weaving, or to hair that needed gloss before a feast. The sheen was not vanity but signal. One could labour hard and still appear orderly. Carried on the belt were the tools of small but vital grooming. Needle cases dangled beside toiletry kits, which might hold tweezers, ear spoons, or nail cleaners carved from bone or metal. These were as necessary as knives, for tidiness was not an afterthought, it was woven into the Viking view of self-respect. A woman reaching for her belt might pluck a thread, clean her ear, or trim a nail, all while tending to fire or food. Her kit was a testament that even amidst toil, care was never abandoned. Thus, women's everyday care was not idle or indulgent. It was the unseen labour that kept households presentable, children healthy, and husbands honourable. It was a shield as much as any round board of linden wood, protecting her kin from shame as well as sickness. In a world of smoke, mud, and sea spray, Viking women carried dignity in their hands, in their oils, in their veils, and in the small tools that swung quietly from their belts, unseen but indispensable. The sagas seldom spoke of it, yet in the longhouses of the north, life carried rhythms far older than war or law. Among these was the quiet, steady tide of a woman's bleeding, a subject wrapped in discretion, yet managed with skill and dignity. Menstruation was no mystery to Viking households, but it was spoken of in hushed tones, handled with cloth, care, and the unbroken strength of women who bore both labour and life. Cloths were the shield against those days. Woven from linen, cut from older shifts, or specially made, they were folded and fastened close to the body, soft enough to absorb, yet strong enough to endure the hours of work. A Viking woman might keep several, rinsed and dried for reuse, her hands practised in the unending cycle of washing and preparing. In the firelight, such cloths were cleaned with the same diligence as shirts or bedding, boiled in water with lye or ash, then laid out to whiten in the sun. What might seem humble was in truth a lifeline, a tool of survival no less important than the comb or the loom. Privacy, however, was another matter. The Viking longhouse was a place of constant company. Kin, thralls, children, and animals often slept beneath the same roof. A woman learned to move with discretion, tending to herself in corners near the hearth or behind a hanging cloth that shielded her for a brief moment. Married women shared knowledge with daughters quietly, passing down methods and herbs, the secrets of when to rest and when to work. If a Viking child asked, answers came in soft tones, for modesty was part of the rhythm. Herbal comfort eased the harsher pains. Yarrow, mugwort, and chamomile were steeped in warm water, drunk as teas, or pressed into poultices laid across the belly. Some women carried sprigs tied to belts or tucked into garments, charms as much as remedies, believed to soften cramps and balance the body. These plants grew wild across the meadows and fields, their bitterness familiar to every household that kept women within its walls. The remedies may not have cured, but they soothed, and in a world of constant toil, even small relief was treasured. Work itself shifted during those days, though never stopped entirely. A Viking woman might sit more by the loom than in the fields, weaving threads while her body carried its own labour. Heavy tasks hauling water, tending the fire, slaughtering livestock could be passed for a time to others in the household. Yet women were resilient, many pressed on regardless, masking discomfort behind discipline, for the needs of family and farm waited for no cycle. Their quiet endurance was its own strength, unmarked by sagas but etched into daily life. Thus, menstruation in Viking times was not scandal nor weakness, but part of the unspoken foundation of survival. Women bore it with discretion, managed it with cloth and herbs, and wove it into the fabric of their duties. Behind the fierce image of Viking warriors and the echo of battle horns, there were women tending not only to wounds of war, but to the natural tides of their own bodies. In the silence of the longhouse, with cloth washed, herbs steeped, and modest privacy carved out, they met each cycle with the same resolve that built ships, raised children, and sustained the North. Pregnancy and birth in the Viking world carried both awe and peril, for in those days every new life balanced on the edge of survival. The longhouse, often a place of noise and labour, grew hushed when the cries of a woman in labour filled its smoky air. It was in these moments that midwives, wise with herbs and hands trained by generations, became the quiet warriors of life. No spear or shield was in their grasp, only cloth, steam, and skill. Yet their role was as vital as any Viking man who stood guard on the battlefield. A woman heavy with child was never idle. She worked the loom, prepared Viking food, tended the fire, or hauled water until her body demanded rest. Yet, when the time came, the household shifted. Midwives arrived, often women who had seen dozens of births and knew by heart the herbs that soothed and the prayers that steadied. They heated water over the hearth, filling wooden tubs for steam or for bathing, the warmth believed to ease pain and open the body. The air was thick with the scent of juniper smoke or yarrow tea, both ritual and remedy, warding spirits as much as sickness. The birthing itself was raw and communal. Women gathered, sisters and kin, their voices murmuring comfort, while strong arms supported the mother. There was no silence of shame. There was labour, sweat, and cries that echoed against timbered walls. A Viking child entered the world, not in solitude, but surrounded by women who knew both the cost and the miracle of birth. The midwife cut the cord with a sharp blade, tied it with linen, and wrapped the newborn in fresh cloth, swaddled tight to keep out the chill of the northern air. Afterward, the bath held sacred importance. Warm water, steeped with herbs, was poured over the mother to cleanse and soothe her weary body. This was not mere hygiene, but ritual, a washing away of blood and pain, a renewal for both mother and child. The baby, too, might be bathed gently, the steam rising like a blessing, sealing the first hours of life in warmth and care. The linen shifts of the mother were changed, and fresh cloth laid upon the bedding, for cleanliness in those moments meant survival. Protective rituals wrapped around the scene, like unseen guards. Charms of iron might be placed nearby, to drive away wandering spirits that sought to steal a newborn's breath. Runic carvings whispered of strength and safe passage. Prayers to the gods and ancestors rose with the smoke, asking that this child live to walk, to eat, to fight, to grow. For every Viking household knew the fragility of life. Many children were lost before they could speak, yet those who survived were treasured as the future of clan and kin. Pregnancy, birth, and the bath were not private matters but woven into the very fabric of Viking life. They demanded endurance, demanded faith, and demanded the tireless care of women whose names seldom appeared in sagas but whose hands shaped the generations. In the dim glow of the hearth, amid steam and linen, life entered the world, raw and unpolished, and yet, with every cry of a new child, the North grew stronger. In the world of the North, wounds were as common as storms, for every Viking man carried the marks of toil or battle upon his skin. Axes split more than wood, knives slipped as easily in the kitchen as on the field, and sickness could creep into even the smallest cut. Healing the hurt was therefore more than a craft. It was survival, a weaving of cleanliness, folk wisdom, and fierce endurance. A Viking child grew up watching the rituals of care, learning that just as a sword must be sharpened, the body too must be tended with discipline and respect. When blood spilled, water was the first ally. Drawn from rivers, wells, or heated at the hearth, it was poured over cuts to wash away dirt, splinters, or soil before infection could take root. Women kept linen cloths ready, boiled or smoked dry, to press against the wound and stanch bleeding. The act of washing was as much ritual as remedy, for all knew that a wound left uncleansed might rot and fester until the arm or life itself was lost. Sea salt held a place of honour in this work. Sailors and farmers alike trusted its sting, mixing salt with water to rinse deep gashes. The pain was sharp, but sharper still was the memory of wounds that turned black without such treatment. Some healers even packed coarse salt directly into cuts, a cruel but effective way to dry the flesh and fight corruption. To the Viking mind, the sea that fed them also purified them, lending its strength against decay. Honey, too, was a treasured balm. Thick and golden, it was spread upon wounds not only to soothe but to seal. The sweetness drew out moisture and hindered rot, while its touch eased the pain of burning skin. To smear honey across a cut was to borrow from the god's own storehouse, a gift that preserved life as well as mead preserved cheer. Where infection threatened, fire was brought forth. Cautery, the pressing of hot iron to flesh, was a last resort, feared yet respected. The hiss of searing skin filled longhouses with dread, but all knew that a moment's agony was better than the slow death of spreading poison. Warriors bore such scars with pride, proof that they had not only faced blades, but also endured the fire of healing. Alcohol, whether mead, ale, or stronger spirits from trade, was poured into wounds when supplies allowed. The bite of the drink burned more than a throat, cleansing gashes and stinging life back into torn flesh. At times it was swallowed too, dulling the mind against the pain of stitching or cautery. A Viking man might drink deeply, then grit his teeth, as a healer sewed his skin with coarse thread, each pull of the needle a step back toward survival. Herbs accompanied these methods: yarrow to staunch bleeding, garlic to fight unseen sickness, juniper smoke to cleanse the air. They were not always enough, but they were never ignored, for folk medicine was stitched into the fabric of daily life. Thus, healing the hurt in Viking times was neither simple nor gentle, but it was relentless. Water, salt, honey, fire, and herbs, these were their weapons against decay, wielded by women at the hearth and healers on the battlefield alike. In their world, to cleanse a wound was to defy death itself, and every scar told not just of injury, but of endurance, a reminder that even in pain, the Vikings refused to yield. Toilets, latrines, and middens, these humble places tell as much about Viking life as longships and swords. For all their sagas of heroes and raids, the Northmen still faced the daily truth of the body, and where it was left mattered. A Viking man could cleave through shields, a Viking child could chase geese through a farmyard, yet at day's end both must crouch where the clan had dug, for nature's call spared no one. In the countryside, simple pits were the answer. Dug near the edge of the homestead, but not so close as to taint the well, these latrines were lined with brush or planks if the household had the means. Over time, they filled layer upon layer of waste pressed into earth until new pits were dug and the old ones covered. The soil bore witness to meals long past, for bones, shells, and scraps of Viking food mingled with the leavings, creating middens that grew into silent records of daily life. These heaps, rank to the nose, yet rich to the soil, drew scavengers and vermin. And so fires, ash, and watchful cats became constant companions. In towns like Hedeby or Jorvik, where streets pressed close and crowds swelled, waste could not be left to chance. Communal latrines were built deep wooden boxes set over pits, sometimes shared by many households. The smell was sharp, but necessity bound the people together in this most private of labours. Archaeologists digging through those darkened layers centuries later found seeds, bones, and even the eggs of worms, grim proof that the past was never spotless. Yet these latrines were an advance, for they kept streets clearer than they might have been, channeling filth into corners where it could be managed. Within the longhouse, chamber pots made of wood or clay served during the night. A Viking woman might empty them at dawn, carrying the contents to the midden or tossing it into the latrine. In crowded households, privacy was a luxury, but dignity was preserved by custom and habit. Even in such matters, there was rhythm. Waste carried out, bedding aired, hearth rekindled, life restored to order before the day's labours began. Keeping vermin at bay was a constant battle. Rats and mice were drawn to middens, feasting on scraps as well as droppings. Cats prowled the longhouses, guardians of grain stores, and silent sentries against plague bringers. Ash from the hearth was sometimes sprinkled to cover waste, its dryness dulling both stench and insect. Smoke too played its part, drifting into corners where filth collected, choking out the pests that thrived in shadow. Though unglamorous, these practices were the backbone of health. To leave waste untended was to invite sickness, yet to manage it with care was to defend the household from unseen foes. The middens grew, layer upon layer, until they became not only dumping grounds, but chronicles of life, each shell, each bone, each seed, a whisper of what the Vikings ate, how they lived, and where they relieved themselves when the sagas were silent. In the end, even the simplest latrine spoke of survival, the quiet truth that behind every feast and raid there was a pit, a pot, and the unyielding need to keep the north livable. Laundry in Viking times was not the gentle swish of cloth in scented water, but a labour that demanded sinew, patience, and endurance. To keep garments fresh was to fight against mud, sweat, smoke, and the daily grime of a world where Viking men swung axes, Viking children tumbled in dirt, and Viking food splattered from hearth fires onto woolen shifts. Clean clothes meant not only comfort but honour, for a family that walked into the thing with white linen beneath its tunics showed itself disciplined and worthy of respect. The work began with soaking. Stained shifts and tunics were steeped in vats of water mixed with lye, a harsh brew made by filtering rainwater through birch ash. This liquid bit into grease and sweat, its sting known to the skin of anyone who handled it. Women, often at the heart of this task, stirred garments with wooden poles, their hands cracked from the caustic touch. Linen bleached beneath the lye, brightening with each boiling, while wool held more stubbornly to the scent of smoke. Yet both were worked until the water turned dark and foul, proof of the effort drawn from weary arms. Once soaked, garments were dragged to riversides or brooks. There, washerwomen bent low over stones, beating cloth with wooden paddles to drive out filth. The sound carried across the valley a steady thud, the river answering with its rush. It was no idle chore, but a test of strength, for the weight of soaked wool or linen could bow a woman's back and blister her palms. A Viking child might help, turning garments or fetching water, learning early that survival meant toil, and cleanliness demanded as much sweat as ploughing a field. In winter, when rivers froze and winds sliced like knives, the work shifted. Snow and ice became unlikely allies. Clothes could be laid out in the frost, beaten, and scrubbed with handfuls of snow, the crystals scouring fabric clean while the cold numbed aching fingers. Some households boiled garments indoors, the steam filling the longhouse, mingling with the ever-present smoke of the hearth. Though harsher on the body, such winter workarounds ensured that filth never triumphed completely, even in the darkest months. The heavy lifting was not shared evenly. Thralls, the enslaved within Viking households, often bore the brunt of this grueling labour, hauling water, wringing cloth, and carrying loads to rivers. Free women oversaw the task, ensuring garments were not only clean but properly whitened and dried. Wealthier families might have dedicated washerwomen, but even they could not escape the endless cycle of rinsing, beating, and hanging garments to dry on hedges or lines. Every family, high or low, knew the necessity of fresh linen, for undergarments worn close to the skin were the true measure of hygiene. Laundry was not only a battle against dirt, but a ritual of renewal. To don clean linen after days of labour was to feel almost reborn, the body lifted from the weight of grime. In this, the washer's work carried dignity, though seldom praised in sagas. Each whitened shirt, each fresh tunic, was a quiet triumph over filth, cold, and exhaustion. Laundry was labour, fierce and unrelenting, but it was also the hidden thread that kept Viking households honourable in the eyes of gods and men alike. When a warband set forth, their ships cutting across grey seas, or their boots trampling foreign soil, the question of survival was not only steel against steel. Clean on campaign was as vital as the sharpness of a Viking sword. For though sagas sing of glory, the truth of war is as much about filth, sweat, and wounds as it is about victory. A Viking man who ignored his body in the field invited rot, sickness, and dishonour. Each warrior carried a small kit, simple yet prized. A bone comb tucked into a pouch, a pair of tweezers, and sometimes an ear spoon. These were not trifles, but defences as essential as a shield. In camps far from home, men lined the banks of streams, stripping to rinse sweat and grime from their skin, washing shifts and tunics while laughing at one another's shivers in the cold water. Cleanliness, even half achieved, lifted spirits. A Viking child might have envied such travel, imagining only feasts and plunder, but those who marched knew the reality was as much about aching backs and stinking boots as the promise of silver. Delousing became a ritual around the fire. Warriors bent low, combs scraping through tangled hair and beards, fingers searching for the tiny pests that thrived in camp beds of straw. Shirts and cloaks were sometimes boiled in cauldrons or held over flames to burn out the vermin. Laughter often masked the grim truth, for lice and fleas were as constant as the wind. A warrior who could not endure the sting of these pests was mocked, but all knew the misery of endless itching beneath wool and mail. Water, though precious, was turned to more than thirst. Wounds were washed in streams, salt carried from the sea, sprinkled into open cuts. Honey, if available, was spread thick over gashes to draw out poison and hasten healing. Alcohol, mead or ale taken in raids was poured over wounds as well as down the throat of the wounded, dulling pain while cleansing torn flesh. In the field, a Viking man trusted his fellows to stitch his skin with coarse thread, his cries swallowed in the noise of camp. These rough treatments meant the difference between life and festering death. Even amid war, there was pride in appearance. Beards were combed, hair oiled if supplies allowed, and tunics rinsed when rivers or rain gave the chance. A band that looked ordered commanded respect, and enemies often marked the difference between a ragged horde and disciplined warriors. Viking leaders knew this, and so they encouraged men to wash, to tend their wounds, to appear fierce but not foul. Cleanliness was not luxury but strategy, for morale rose when men felt renewed, even in hostile lands. Thus, on campaign, hygiene became its own form of warfare, against lice, against filth, against the creeping hand of infection. The Vikings fought with comb, cloth, salt, and fire. Their sagas may praise axes raised high, but behind each warrior stood these humble practices, quiet victories that kept them alive long enough to carve their names into history. Clean on campaign was not vanity, it was survival, written in water, ash, and blood. Aboard the longship, the sea was both friend and foe, a restless companion that demanded constant vigilance. The long, narrow craft that carried Viking men across oceans was not only a vessel of war and trade, but also a living space, crowded with bodies, gear, and the unyielding scent of tar and salt. To survive the voyage meant more than braving storms. It meant keeping sickness at bay in a place where water, food, and air were never far from corruption. Water was guarded as though it were silver. Stored in barrels sealed with pitch, it was precious and rationed, for once it turned foul, the crew faced misery. A Viking child who played by the shore might take fresh streams for granted, but aboard a ship, every drop mattered. Sometimes seawater itself was used for rinsing, harsh and stinging to the mouth, but serviceable for washing hands, faces, and even wounds. Salted rinses, though rough, offered a way to cleanse without wasting the sweeter drink. To wash clothes at sea was rare, but garments could be doused with brine and hung to dry in the wind, leaving them stiff yet purged of filth. The smell aboard a longship was its own tale. Fish, dried or newly caught, filled the air with their tang. Tar smeared thick on planks, to seal the hull, added a dark, sticky odour that clung to skin and cloak alike. Sweat from Viking men working the oars mixed with the stench of wet wool, forming a cloud of human labour that no breeze could fully sweep away. To step onto such a ship was to step into a world where the sea itself seeped into every corner of life, sharp, pungent, and unforgettable. Cleanliness of the deck was no idle concern. The planks needed to be kept clear not only for work but to prevent sickness. Scrubbing with seawater was common, sailors bending low with brushes of bundled twigs, scouring away fish blood, spilled food, or worse. Waste was thrown overboard swiftly, for no crew could endure a midden beneath their feet. Discipline in such matters was survival, for a filthy deck invited both vermin and illness. Still, sickness could strike. To prevent its spread, men shared simple rules. Do not drink from another's vessel. Do not leave food to rot. Do not linger in filth. Salted meat and dried fish were staples, but herbs gathered from ports were chewed or steeped when possible, easing stomachs or freshening the mouth. If fever spread among the crew, the voyage became perilous, for no one could escape the confined air of the ship. Some captains carried charms of bone or iron, trusting them to guard against unseen spirits of disease, while healers mixed remedies from whatever herbs or resins they had carried from land. Life aboard the longship was hard, but it was also ordered. Each Viking man bore responsibility not only for rowing and fighting, but also for keeping himself clean enough to endure. Water barrels, salted rinses, scrubbed decks, and rituals of order kept the sea from swallowing more than it already claimed. In this way, even upon the open waves, the Vikings carried with them the same fierce discipline they showed in battle, for filth was an enemy as dangerous as storm or sword. Feast, smoke, and soot, these three shaped the very air within a Viking longhouse. When a gathering was called, whether for a wedding, a victory, or the visit of a jarl, the hall came alive with fire, song, and the thick perfume of roasted meat. Yet beneath the laughter and the clatter of horns, there was an unspoken order, a code of care that kept filth from overwhelming the hearth. Cleanliness, even in such revels, was never forgotten. The rafters bore the marks of countless feasts. Smoke rose from open fires, curling into the beams until they turned black and slick with soot. A Viking child might stare upward, tracing shapes in the darkened wood, unaware that the same smoke-stained garments and hair, settling into every fold of linen, clothes hung near the fire to dry or air out after journeys, would soon take on the smell of burning pine or oak. This scent clung as stubbornly as shadow, a badge of hall life, and though not unpleasant to the Viking nose, it was a reminder of the work needed to keep garments from becoming stiff with smoke. Before hands touched food, they touched water. Bowls were passed, and each Viking man and woman washed their fingers, for grease and grime were companions of the day's labour. Guests might dip into basins of warm water infused with herbs, the steam rising gently in the firelight, a small luxury that lent dignity to the feast. Clean hands were not merely practical, they showed respect to host and gods alike, for no man should lift a horn or tear bread with hands that bore the soil of the fields or the blood of the hunt. As the feast roared on, bones, shells, and scraps of Viking food piled high. Yet even here there was rhythm. Dogs skulked under benches, snapping up what fell, while servants and thralls swept the rushes, removing what would rot and foul the air. Once the drinking horns were drained, and the last songs sung, the hall turned from revel to labour. Ashes were shovelled, rushes replaced, benches wiped down. The longhouse, so briefly transformed into a roaring den of joy, was restored to its sober order. Soot was not so easily banished. Women would take cloaks and tunics outside to beat them, shaking free not only ash, but fleas and lice stirred by the warmth of the hall. A Viking woman, with her linen veil drawn tight against the chill, would raise garments high, letting the wind sweep through them, a ritual as important as any prayer. The sight of clothes fluttering against a grey sky was a sign of care, a quiet battle against the creeping grip of filth. Feasts were grand, but their aftermath revealed the discipline beneath Viking life. To wash hands before, to air garments after, to sweep the hall clean. These customs kept honour as polished as the shields upon the wall. Soot and smoke might be inescapable, but order turned them from decay into memory, and every feast left not only a tale for the skald, but a house prepared for the next dawn. Law, honour, and cleanliness were woven tighter in Viking society than many would imagine. To be clean was not vanity, it was the mark of discipline, self-respect, and worthiness before both kin and gods. A Viking man who strode into the thing with hair uncombed, beard matted, and garments unwashed invited mockery as sharp as any spear. A Viking woman who presented her household in foul linen was judged no less harshly. In a world where words could wound deeper than swords, appearance and odour became part of the law of honour itself. Assemblies, or things, were more than councils. They were stages where reputation was laid bare. Warriors, farmers, and chieftains gathered side by side, and each eye measured the other's. A man standing could rise or fall not only by his speech, but by the state of his clothing. Fresh linen, hair bound neatly, beard trimmed or combed, all these were signs of a man fit to be heard. Unkempt hair, or a stench of rot, branded him careless, perhaps even dishonourable. To accuse another of filth was not merely jest, it was insult, a blow to his standing that might spark feud or demand redress. Marriage, too, was bound to cleanliness. When families weighed the worth of a suitor, they looked not only to his cattle, weapons, or silver, but also to his bearing. A Viking child, born into a household of order, grew beneath the respect its elders had earned through diligence. A man who smelled of sweat and ale, whose hands were always black with neglect, was judged unworthy of a noble match. By contrast, the man who wore white linen beneath his tunic and combed his hair until it gleamed could hope to win a bride of higher station. To appear clean was to promise that one's household would be strong, disciplined, and enduring. Insults in Viking culture often carried the sting of dirt. To call a man foul was to say more than that he stank. It was to brand him dishonourable, lazy, or unfit for fellowship. Skalds and warriors alike hurled such barbs, knowing well that filth was shameful. A man might endure being called slow or unlucky, but to be named unwashed, lice-ridden, or stinking was to be stripped of dignity in the eyes of peers. Such words demanded answer, whether through duel, fine, or feud. Yet beyond pride and insult, there was order in these customs. Cleanliness was tied to law not by written code alone, but by practice, by the expectations of the community. To be clean was to show respect for the thing, for one's kin, and for the gods who judged all men. To be foul was to dishonour each of these. Even in sagas, heroes are often described not just by valour, but by gleaming hair, bright eyes, and fine garments. Such details were not idle. They marked the difference between a worthy man and one unfit for memory. Thus, in Viking times, law and honour were steeped in the simple acts of washing, combing, and wearing fresh linen. Cleanliness was more than habit. It was the unseen armour that guarded reputation, secured alliances, and silenced insult before it could strike. Pagan purity and Christian influence met in uneasy union as the centuries turned, shaping how Vikings washed, worshipped, and weighed the meaning of cleanliness. In the old ways, water was not only for the body, it was sacred, alive with spirit. Streams that sparkled beneath the birch carried more than refreshment. They were the veins of the gods, places where a Viking man might rinse his hands before oath or sacrifice. Ritual rinsing was common, a simple yet solemn act, whether before the blot, at feasts, or when welcoming a guest. To wash then was not vanity but respect, a quiet offering to unseen powers. Taboos also guided these habits. Certain waters were believed holy, others cursed. Springs could heal or harm, and rivers were often entered with caution, prayers whispered before stepping into their flow. A Viking child might be dipped into a stream not only to cleanse its skin, but to call upon the water's blessing, a fragile shield against sickness or misfortune. In such moments, purity was not measured in soap or scrubbing, but in intention, in showing reverence to the elements that bound life together. Then came the cross, carried into the north by priests and kings. With it came new pressures, new eyes upon the habits of the people. Christian teaching spoke of modesty, of guarding the body from the gaze of others. Bathing, once a communal act where men and women could share steam and laughter, grew suspect beneath the stern words of priests. To be naked together was no longer a matter of warmth or fellowship, but temptation, a doorway to sin. The bathhouse, once a place of cleansing and camaraderie, was shadowed by sermons that branded it scandalous. Yet the church also brought its own water, holy water, drawn, blessed, and sprinkled upon the faithful. Washing now carried a new layer of meaning, no longer just respect to gods of earth and sky, but obedience to the one God preached by priests. Children were bathed in baptism, their first wash an eternal one, binding them to the faith. Cleanliness began to stretch beyond the body into the soul, where dirt was no longer just sweat and soot, but sin itself, demanding constant vigilance. Still, the old ways did not vanish overnight. A Viking woman might keep her herbal rinses, steeping rosemary and yarrow even as she attended Mass. A Viking man might wash his hands before entering church, just as he once had before lifting a horn to Thor. Pagan purity and Christian influence mingled, clashed, and shaped a new understanding of what it meant to be clean. Washing became not only a defense against lice or filth, but a symbol of modesty, piety, and respect. By the end of the age, the Viking view of bathing had shifted. Once it was vigor and ritual, a celebration of life's rawness. Under Christian influence, it grew restrained, modest, and bound to the soul's health as much as the body's. Cleanliness, whether with sacred spring or holy water, remained a mirror of belief, carrying with it the weight of honour, faith, and fate. In the bustling markets of clean, the Viking world revealed its hunger not only for silver and slaves, but also for the subtler treasures of scent, softness, and care. Longships carried back more than weapons and woven cloth. They brought the oils of the south, the resins of distant forests, and the strange soaps of the Mediterranean, items that turned daily hygiene into quiet luxuries. To walk through a marketplace in Hedeby or Kaupang was to be struck by more than the clang of metal and the smell of Viking food. There was also the fragrance of trade, whispers of distant lands, where cleanliness was not only survival but art. Imported oils gleamed in small vials, drawn from olives, almonds, and other fruits unknown to northern soil. For a Viking man, these oils served to soften hair or beard, or to rub into weathered skin after the salt spray of the sea. A Viking woman might use them more delicately, working a drop into braids or smoothing her hands before weaving, their scent lingering in the air like a mark of status. To smell faintly of the south was to proclaim that one's kin had wealth enough to touch the wider world. Resins also arrived, amber from the Baltic mingling with frankincense and myrrh brought up from the east. These were burned in halls, their smoke masking the heavy scent of soot and sweat, and sometimes mixed into rinses to perfume garments. A Viking child watching the curling trails might not know the names of these substances, but would remember the rare sharpness of their fragrance, different from the herbs of their homeland. These goods turned gatherings into something grander, layering the air with foreign mystery. Pumice stones, pale and porous, came from volcanic shores. In markets they were prized, passed from hand to hand as though they were jewels. These stones, though rough, were valued for scrubbing skin rubbed until it glowed, grime lifted from calloused feet and hard palms. They were the tools of warriors and women alike, bought by those who could afford to polish themselves a little cleaner than their neighbours. And then there were soaps. While Viking folk had long made their own coarse sap from ash and tallow, traders returning from Frankish or Mediterranean ports carried bars unlike anything seen at home. Castile soap, rich with olive oil, lathered softly, leaving skin scented rather than scoured. To bathe with such a thing was to taste a luxury beyond the reach of most. These soaps, traded at high price, became coveted gifts, tokens of prestige, exchanged between households, their presence a mark of far-reaching connection. Thus, markets of clean were not idle corners of trade, but places where identity was sharpened. A man who bore oil in his beard, a woman who perfumed her linen with resin, a child washed with foreign soap, all spoke without words of journeys made and wealth secured. In the Viking world, where honour and appearance were bound together, these imported treasures carried as much weight as swords or ships. Cleanliness, enriched by trade, became yet another battlefield where status was won. On Viking farmsteads, the rhythm of cleanliness followed the land itself. A spring bubbling near the pasture, a stream winding past the edge of a field. These were not luxuries, but lifelines. Here, a Viking man could kneel to wash the soil from his arms after a day's toil, or a Viking woman could soak linen in cool water before spreading it on rocks to dry beneath the sun. Children splashed in shallow banks, their laughter carrying across meadows, while buckets of water were hauled to the longhouse for rinsing, cooking, or tending the hearth. Cleanliness on the farmstead was simple, woven into daily labour, and the air itself seemed to help fresh with pine, hay, and the scent of damp earth after rain. But in towns, the story changed. Hedeby, Birka, Jorvik, these were not quiet clearings, but crowded hives of trade, noise, and stench. The streams that ran so clear on the farmstead here became channels of refuse. Drains, dug with care, carried waste away, though not always swiftly enough. Middens rose near doorways, layered with scraps of Viking food, broken bones, and ash from countless fires. Still, order was not absent. Neighbourhood rules, though unwritten, governed the flow of filth. A man who fouled the shared path or left waste too long was soon rebuked, for even in the press of houses and stalls, no one wished to live knee-deep in rot. The smells of the town were inescapable. Tanners scraped hides in open air, the sharp tang of urine and lye seeping into every corner. Fish markets spilled their bounty onto planks slick with scales, gulls circling above in endless hunger. Smoke from hearths and forges tangled together, thickening the air until it clung to hair and cloak. Yet, amid all this, people still washed. Buckets of water were drawn from wells, clothes beaten and scrubbed, bodies rinsed as often as custom and season allowed. To appear in the market unkempt was to risk insult, for even where stink was common, a man's honour was not. Farmsteads offered freedom from such crush. The stream could cleanse both skin and spirit. The open wind could dry linen without fear of soot or neighbours' filth. But they lacked the goods of the town. Imported oils, fine combs, and fragrant herbs were rarities, unless carried home from market. The town, for all its stench, gave access to these treasures. A Viking child raised within its walls might endure the reek of hides and fish, yet grow accustomed to the sight of combs carved from antler and soaps from the south. A child on the farm might breathe cleaner air, but knew fewer of such refinements. In the end, Viking life balanced between these worlds. The farmstead offered purity of stream and field, while the town brought both corruption and culture. One washed in the cold brook, the other in a basin fetched from a crowded well. Both sought to stay clean enough to hold honour, yet the scent of one was hay and hearth, while the scent of the other was smoke, fish, and ambition. Cleanliness, whether rustic or urban, was never only about health. It was the measure of place, of life, lived close to nature or pressed tight among neighbours. Cold, climate, and adaptation shaped every breath the Vikings took, and every wash they dared in a land where winter held the earth in iron grasp. To speak of hygiene in such a place is to speak of survival, for the same snow that bit the skin also served as water when rivers froze and streams slept beneath sheets of ice. A Viking man knew that his body could not go long without cleansing, yet he also knew that plunging recklessly into frigid water could stiffen his limbs and still his heart. Thus, cunning ways of the north arose, small acts of adaptation that allowed cleanliness even in frost's cruel season. Snow itself became a servant. A Viking child, sent outdoors in the pale light of winter, might be rubbed down with handfuls of packed snow by a laughing elder. The cold scoured away sweat, grit, and even odour, leaving skin stung but fresh, a primitive scrub in place of warm water. Warriors returning from toil could strip to the waist and scour their bodies with snow, shivering, cursing, yet rising afterward with blood quickened and spirits sharper. The cold was not an enemy then, but a tool, a rough cleanser gifted by the very land that tested them. Yet not all solutions were so harsh. In the heart of winter, when longhouses creaked beneath the weight of frost, Vikings turned to fire and steam. Stones were heated until they glowed, water flung upon them to release clouds of vapour. In these makeshift saunas, sweat poured from the body, carrying filth with it, and the air itself seemed to burn clean. Families gathered within, stripping down in the haze, scrubbing with cloths, and emerging as though reborn. In Iceland, where hot springs steamed even while snow fell, the gods themselves seemed to provide baths, and there both man and woman found relief from the unending chill. Clothing, too, had its rites of winter cleansing. Tunics, shifts, and cloaks hung upon racks near the hearth, smoke swirling around them. Though it blackened the fabric, smoke also dried, warmed, and acted as a purifier. A Viking woman might shake out the garments afterward, confident that the odour of hearth smoke was preferable to the stench of sweat. In this way, fire did more than feed, and warm it cleansed, turning wool and linen into something bearable for another season of wear. Water, in the frost season, was rationed like treasure. A household might boil a single cauldron, poured into basins where each took a turn to wash hands, face, or feet. The thought of full immersion was folly. Even nobles seldom wasted such heat when wood itself was precious. Instead, cloths were soaked and wrung, used to wipe the body bit by bit. To be clean in winter meant ingenuity, patience, and often the humility to accept that clean enough was victory against the elements. Thus, cold was not merely endured but answered. Snow became soap, steam became salvation, smoke became shield, and water ever scarce was cherished as gold. In this dance with the climate, the Vikings proved that hygiene was not only ritual but adaptation, the art of remaining human in a world determined to harden men into ice. Children and elders, the bookends of Viking life, carried their own burdens of care, and with them came rituals of cleanliness, that spoke not only of hygiene, but of tenderness. In a world where a Viking man might ride to war, and a Viking woman might wrestle with endless labour, the smallest and frailest required gentler rhythms. To wash a Viking child or tend an aging parent was not simply duty, it was an act of love wrapped in cloth, water, and patience. For infants, the longhouse made special space. Newborns were rinsed soon after birth, warm water mixed with herbs to guard the skin and ease the shock of life's first breath. Cradle hygiene was constant. Linen swaddles were washed more often than any other garment, boiled to chase away filth and softened near the hearth before wrapping the child again. A mother or nurse would run her fingers through a baby's fine hair, checking for nits, for even the youngest were not spared the crawling pests of the age. A Viking child's comb might be carved small, antler teeth fine enough to chase away lice, teaching from the cradle that cleanliness was survival. As children grew, they were taught the daily habits that marked honour. A boy might sit while his father guided a comb through his hair, showing him how to check the teeth for lice. A girl might watch her mother steep herbs in water, dipping cloths to wash face and hands before meals. Knit patrol was not a moment of shame but a family ritual, one child crouched by the fire while another's head was searched, laughter often breaking out despite the task. These small acts created discipline and pride, for a well-groomed child reflected well on kin and stood as proof of a household's order. Elders required different care. The years bent their backs, stiffened their joints, and dulled their strength. For them, hygiene was softened. A Viking woman might heat water carefully in a cauldron, pouring it into a basin where an elder's feet could soak, easing the aches of travel and toil. Warmed cloths, wrung and laid across arms or face, refreshed those too weak for full bathing. Soft linens, washed with greater care, were placed near the skin of the aged, sparing them from the coarse wool that younger bodies endured without complaint. The hearth was central to this care. Elders were brought close to the fire, where smoke dried their garments and heat made washing less cruel. Herbs were mixed not only for scent, but for comfort: sage to soothe, rosemary to sharpen. A Viking man too old for the oar or sword might sit wrapped in furs, while his daughter or grandchild combed his hair, the act as much about respect as it was about hygiene. In such moments, age was honoured, not hidden. Thus, the circle of life in Viking times was held together by water, comb, and cloth. Children were taught to endure knit and dirt with discipline, while elders were tended with warmth and reverence. Cleanliness was more than survival. It was a thread binding generations, proof that even in a world of hardship, care endured. Fashioned for clean, such was the quiet wisdom hidden in the garments of the north. To look upon a Viking man striding into the assembly, or a Viking woman tending the hearth, one might first see strength, colour, and craft. Yet beneath the beauty of braid and brooch lay a practical truth. Clothing itself was a tool for cleanliness. In a land where water froze hard and soap stung the skin, the cut and fabric of every garment were chosen to guard the body, preserve dignity, and make washing less a torment and more a craft of cunning. At the core of this design was linen. Worn closest to the skin, the undertunic for a Viking man and the shift for a Viking woman served as the true shield against sweat and soil. Linen breathed, absorbed, and carried away what the body cast off, sparing the heavier outer garments from filth. It could be laundered more often, boiled and beaten in rivers until pale again, and laid upon the grass or snow to dry in the open air. To change into fresh linen was to feel reborn, the body wrapped once more in cool, clean cloth. A Viking child, scampering across the fields, often wore shifts, patched and repatched, but still of linen, for even the smallest deserved the comfort of cloth that kissed rather than clawed the skin. Over this linen came wool woven thick, dyed bold, and cut to endure. Wool cloaks, tunics, and dresses formed the visible strength of Viking attire, and here, tailoring itself aided hygiene. Wool repelled rain, resisted dirt, and could be shaken clean when soil clung to the hem. Its oils gave it resilience, and when smoke from the hearth drifted into its threads, it masked odours that might otherwise betray long days of toil. To wash wool too often was folly, for the fabric was dear and the labour harsh. Instead, Vikings fashioned it to endure with little laundering, knowing the linen beneath would take the burden. Cloaks were more than warmth, they were shields. A Viking man trudging through a muddy market, or a woman carrying Viking food from stalls back to the longhouse, wrapped her cloak tight, protecting finer clothes beneath. When the cloak bore the brunt of grime, it could be beaten, smoked, or brushed free, sparing the rest of the attire. In this way, fashion became armour, not only against weather, but against the world's unclean touch. Even the tailoring itself spoke of practical grace. Garments were cut with simple lines, easy to lift, shift, or strip away for washing. Sleeves could be rolled, hems hitched up, tunics layered or exchanged according to labour or occasion. The design was never mere vanity, it was foresight. A farmer could return from the fields, shed an outer tunic crusted with earth, and sit at table in linen still fair. Thus, in the Viking world, clothing was more than covering it, was a silent partner in hygiene. Linen bore the body's burdens, wool guarded from the outer world, cloaks took the grime, and all were fashioned for quick tending by fire or stream. To dress was to prepare not only for work and war, but for the endless struggle to stay clean in a land where dirt and frost forever pressed close. Archaeology speaks where the sagas fall silent, whispering truths about Viking life through fragments too humble for poets to praise. It is in the soil, the pits, and the remnants of the ordinary that the real story of hygiene emerges, not from gilded halls or carved stones, but from combs worn smooth, scraps of linen, and the stubborn remains of what the body left behind. From these fragments, the world of Viking man, Viking woman, and Viking child unfolds with startling clarity and sometimes with unflinching bluntness. Coprolites, the polite word for ancient droppings, tell tales no skald would weave. Dug from middens and latrine pits, these hardened remains reveal the Viking diet: barley, oats, herringbones, seeds of apples and berries. Yet, along with food, came less welcome discoveries. Whipworm, roundworm, tapeworm. Parasites thrived in a world where chamber pots were emptied into streets or pits dug too close to wells. Even so, these findings speak of resilience, for despite such burdens, Viking folk endured, farmed, fought, and thrived across sea and shore. Latrines themselves reveal a mix of order and necessity. In towns like Jorvik and Hedeby, archaeologists uncovered wooden-lined pits where waste collected, layered, year after year, like pages in a foul-smelling chronicle. From them, one can smell the press of crowded streets and know that cleanliness was sought but rarely won. Yet even these pits show effort: coverings of straw, attempts to line and control the spread, proof that Vikings fought back against filth with the means at hand. Combs speak louder still. Found in graves, houses, and marketplaces, they were carved from bone or antler, their fine teeth blackened with age, but still sharp with purpose. In them, archaeologists find both beauty and burden. Nits and lice, trapped between the teeth, reveal the constant war against pests. Yet the very abundance of combs shows their importance. No Viking man went to a thing without his hair in order. No Viking woman neglected her braids. And even a Viking child might carry a small comb tied to a belt. Grooming was not vanity alone, it was honour. Tartar on Viking teeth tells its own story. Hardened layers cling still to jawbones unearthed from graves, carrying within them the grit of bread baked with stone-ground flour, flecks of herbs, even smoke from countless hearths. Cavities were fewer than in later ages, thanks to diets low in sugar, but wear was harsh and tooth loss common. Yet traces of mint, fennel, and ash in the Tartar whisper of effort, rinses, chews, and remedies to freshen breath and ward decay. Fragments of textiles, too, bring evidence. Linen stained yet preserved by the damp earth shows the weave of undergarments, proof of garments worn and washed often. Wool, stiffened with smoke and grease, reveals the outer layer that shielded all beneath. These scraps prove that Viking clothing was designed as much for hygiene as for warmth and display, a system of layers that allowed the skin to stay fresh while the outer shell bore the dirt of the world. Archaeology speaks with brutal honesty. It tells us that Vikings scratched at lice, spat blood from worn gums, and lived amid the stench of waste. But it also proves they combed their hair, washed with herbs, wore linen close to the skin, and sought dignity in the face of dirt. What is still debated, the frequency of bathing, the role of steam huts, the spread of imported soaps, remains for scholars to argue. Yet in the soil itself, the truth is plain. The Vikings were neither savages wallowing in filth, nor saints of spotless purity. They were people who fought a daily, ingenious, and honourable battle against the grime of their age, leaving behind evidence that still speaks across the centuries. The tale of filthy Vikings has echoed through centuries, repeated in chronicles, whispered in classrooms, and painted in popular imagination. Yet when one turns to the sagas, to the soil, and to the fragments left behind, a more complex truth emerges, one that pulls the beard of stereotype and forces us to see the Viking man and woman not as reeking brutes, but as people deeply conscious of appearance, cleanliness, and honour. Myths and reality tangle like seaweed in the tide, and it is only by teasing them apart that the true story comes to light. Outsider chronicles, penned by monks and travellers, often dripped with disdain. To the English, who suffered Viking raids, painting their enemies as unwashed savages served a purpose. One chronicler remarked bitterly that Viking men bathed once a week, an exaggeration meant as insult. But in truth, this detail reveals something remarkable. In an age when most Europeans bathed rarely, if at all, Vikings stood out precisely because they washed more often. Saturday itself, lagerdager, meant washing day, and to step freshly cleaned into feast or assembly was part of custom, not indulgence. The sagas, though woven of heroics and legend, also whisper everyday truths. Within their tales lie scenes of grooming, where a Viking man combs his hair before meeting a rival, or a woman oils and braids her locks before a gathering. There are descriptions of finely carved combs, polished tweezers, and the small toiletry kits often found in graves. Would such detail have survived if these acts were rare or unimportant? The sagas reveal a culture that linked grooming to readiness, clean hair, neat beard, and orderly garments were signs of strength, discipline, and worthiness before gods and kin alike. Reality was more complex than either insult or ideal. A Viking child might itch from lice, and an elder might live in a longhouse thick with smoke and soot. Waste pits stank, parasites spread, and the scent of animals clung to clothes. Yet this does not mean the people embraced filth. They fought against it with combs, rinses, steam, herbs, and above all, linen worn close to the skin. Archaeology proves it. Hundreds of combs lie buried, soap remnants made from ash and fat endure, and even parasite-laden coprolites show a people contending with their environment rather than surrendering to it. The myth of unclean Vikings was born of scorn, yet, ironically, it testifies to their difference. Foreigners noticed their habits because they contrasted with their own. A Saxon might see a Viking man wash his face, comb his hair, and step into market with garments brushed and cloak fastened, and to him it seemed strange, even unsettling. For a warrior who raided by sea, yet cared for his appearance with such detail, was an enemy both fearsome and hard to dismiss. Thus, myth and reality fold together. The Vikings were neither saints of spotless purity, nor savages mired in filth. they were human proud, resourceful, and pragmatic. They scratched at lice, yes, but they also perfumed their hair with herbs. They lived amid smoke, but they also sought the clarity of steam and water. They were, above all, a people who believed that honour began not only in battle, but also in how one carried oneself before the eyes of gods and neighbours. And in this light, the insult of filth becomes instead a testament to their care. Beside their neighbours, the Vikings stood out as both familiar and strange mirrors of shared customs, yet sharpened by northern air and their own restless spirit. To compare them with Anglo-Saxons, Slavs, or the refined peoples of Byzantium and the Islamic world is to glimpse a spectrum of habits, where hygiene, grooming, and daily care became both a mark of difference and a bridge of kinship. In these contrasts, the Viking man, Viking woman, and Viking child reveal themselves not as isolated figures, but as part of a greater tapestry, borrowing, adapting, and sometimes stubbornly ignoring what lay beyond the fjords. To the Anglo-Saxons across the sea, Vikings were at once foes and rivals. English chroniclers grumbled of raids and cruelty, yet even through their curses slipped hints of envy. The Vikings, it was said, washed more often, combed their hair daily, and changed linen with a frequency that unsettled their Christian neighbours. This care in appearance gave Viking men a reputation for charm, and indeed, some Anglo-Saxon women were said to find them dangerously attractive. The insult of vanity concealed a truth. Compared to their English counterparts, many Vikings worked harder to appear well kept. Yet, in other matters, such as waste disposal and parasites, both peoples shared the same burdens, with middens, lice, and smoke-stained clothes, uniting them in the gritty realities of medieval life. Eastward, among the Slavs, the picture shifts. Here, the Vikings, who became known as the Rus, mingled with river tribes, trading, marrying, and settling along great waterways. From them, Viking men and women encountered wooden bathhouses heated by stone and steam, a tradition that would echo in Russian banyas for centuries. Archaeological traces and later chronicles suggest that the Norse were impressed, and in lands where forests stretched endless, they embraced such steam rituals. To a Viking child growing up in Novgorod or Kiev, cleanliness might have carried the scent of birch branches and the heat of firestones, proof of how swiftly Norsemen could absorb and adapt. Farther south, in the dazzling courts of Byzantium and the bustling markets of the Islamic world, the contrast was sharper still. Here, baths were not rustic huts or riverbank pools, but great halls of marble and mosaic, with flowing water, perfumes, and elaborate ritual. A Viking guard, in the service of the emperor, one of the famed Varangians, would have seen grooming raised to an art, the air perfumed with oils, the skin softened by scented waters. To him, it must have seemed a world apart, yet some habits found their way north. Trade carried not only silk and silver, but soap of olive oil, pumice stones, and resins, small luxuries that marked status in Viking towns. Still, while they borrowed what could be carried home, they never surrendered their own rhythms. Washing once a week in Lagerdager fashion endured, even when others bathed daily in marble halls. Thus, beside their neighbours, the Vikings reveal their dual nature, proud of their own customs, yet never blind to the virtues of others. They borrowed the bathhouse from Slavs, the soap from the south, and the linen habit stood as their own invention. They ignored certain luxuries as excess, yet wove foreign goods into their markets with eager hands. In the end, the Viking world was not closed, but porous, forever shaped by those they met, whether across a market stall or upon the field of war. And in these encounters, the truth of their hygiene shines clearer. Not filth, not perfection, but adaptation, a culture that bent, borrowed, and endured, always washed in the waters of both their own streams and their neighbours' wells. The legacies of northern clean stretch far beyond the age of sails and longships, echoing still in the steam of saunas, the freshness of linen, and the small but enduring rituals of order and care. Though centuries have passed, the habits of the Viking man, Viking woman, and even the Viking child continue to ripple through northern lands, shaping what it means to live with dignity in a harsh climate. To understand this inheritance is to see how practical routines hardened into traditions, and how traditions, in turn, became culture. The Saturday wash, lagadaga, is perhaps the most striking thread that runs unbroken from the Viking age to modern life. While many medieval Europeans recoiled from frequent bathing, Norse folk insisted that the week's toil be rinsed away before feast, trade, or worship. A Viking man might scrub in cold water at a stream, or sit in steam drawn from hot stones and herbs, but he would not go into gathering unwashed. This rhythm of weekly cleansing persists, finding new form in the Saturday sauna of Scandinavia, the Russian banya, and the Icelandic hot spring. What was once a necessity of honour is now a cherished ritual of health and fellowship, proof that some habits endure because they make sense. Linen, too, remains a legacy. In Viking households, fresh undertunics and shifts mattered more than full immersion in water. Changing the garment closest to the skin kept filth at bay, guarded against odour, and gave the impression of care. Archaeology reveals how common this practice was, and even today, the northern preference for natural fibres, linen in summer, wool layered above echoes, the old wisdom. Breathable garments, washed often, still anchor the rhythm of cleanliness in climates where winter resists all efforts at comfort. The comb is another heirloom of hygiene. Viking combs of bone and antler, buried with warriors and farmers alike, reveal a culture that placed grooming close to honour. Clean hair and neat beards marked readiness for assembly or battle. That legacy survives in the pride taken in hair care across northern lands, where braiding, oiling, and careful maintenance remain as much a cultural marker as they were for a Viking bride on her wedding morning. Steam itself, born of fire and water, was among the Vikings' greatest allies, and its legacy continues to define the north. In Iceland, natural hot springs still draw entire families to bathe, while across Scandinavia, the sauna remains a space of cleansing, both physical and spiritual. To step into the heat, to sweat, to scour the skin with birch, is to follow in the path of ancestors who once crouched in turf huts or by steaming pools, believing that warmth, water, and breath could drive out more than dirt. It could drive out ill luck and renew the soul. These habits endure not merely because they worked, but because they spoke to something deeper. Cleanliness in the Viking world was not just about health, but about reputation, readiness, and belonging. A Viking child combed before the hearth, a Viking woman laundering linen by the river, a Viking man oiling his beard before the thing all affirmed that to live with care was to live with honour. And so, long after the longships ceased their voyages, the legacy of northern clean remained, binding health to dignity and dignity to tradition. It is why, even today, to bathe on Saturday or sit in a cloud of sauna steam is more than comfort. It is kinship with those who came before.